China warned Canada, release the country's high-profile telecom executive Meng Wanzhou, or there will be consequences. Now, 2 Canadians are detained in China, a former diplomat and a businessman. Meng is out on bail, but still in Vancouver, awaiting possible extradition to the U.S., and China is ratcheting up the anti-Canada rhetoric. The CBC's Katie Simpson is on the story for us. Hey, Katie, thanks for being here. So what's the latest, I guess, or is there any update on the condition of the 2 men in custody or detained by China?
This is an evolving story, and so we keep going back to Global Affairs saying, have you had contact with either of the men? Have you had direct contact? And as of this moment right now, what we're being told by Global Affairs is no, they still haven't had that direct contact with either of the 2 Canadians who are being detained right now. We know that they are now being separately accused of endangering China's national security. Beijing held a news conference while Canadians slept, revealing those details, but they wouldn't give any specifics as to what's going on. But we do know that China is ramping up the pressure campaign on Canada to release Meng Wanzhou, who, of course, is the Huawei CFO who is being detained on the request of the U.S. possibly to be extradited to the United States. Beijing is not explicitly linking the detention of those Canadians to her case, but, of course, the inference is there, and the frustration from Chinese authorities is very clear at this point. China's ambassador to Canada actually wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail today, and we have a part of that. It's very clear. It says, those who accuse China of detaining some person in retaliation for the arrest of Ms. Meng should first reflect on the actions of the Canadian side. It is both ignominious and hypocritical, to revile China with double standards. The Chinese people used to have a favorable impression of Canada, but Canada's behavior this time has chilled their feelings. So that is a very blunt shot at Canada. We also know that while the Canadian government is trying to get more information about what's going on, they're also trying to downplay some of the long-term consequences. Tourism Minister Melanie Joly confirmed she still plans to go to China next week to celebrate 2018 is actually the year of Canada-China tourism. It's ending in quite a spectacular fashion, but she's still planning to go. And then former Trade Minister François-Philippe Champagne, he spoke to reporters today, and he didn't seem to think that there's going to be any long-term consequences for the trading relationship.
The trading relationship will continue. You know, states, you cannot judge a trade relationship on a daily basis. This is over decades. The relationship will continue, things will happen, but like I said, our focus now is on the Canadians.
And so that focus being on the Canadians, Global Affairs is trying to, the main thing they're trying to do right now is actually get physical contact with both men who are being detained. And as of right now, this could change. As of right now, no one's confirmed that that's happened.
Okay, and we know that President Trump threatened a couple days ago to intervene, or not threatened, but said that he was considering intervening in the case of the CFO, if that might end, trade animosity between China and the U.S. What has that position done to the relationship between Canada and the U.S., or what reaction has the Canadian government had?
Yeah, if things weren't tense enough with China right now, there's a new flare-up between Canada-U.S. relations. And what a senior source with direct knowledge of the situation has told me that Canada has reached a new level of frustration with Donald Trump after he made those comments earlier this week. It was during an interview with Reuters where Donald Trump sat down and said if it would be to his country's advantage, he would consider intervening in the Huawei case. Canada had spent 2 days very publicly saying Canada is a country that is a rule of law. There is no political interference in this. And so when Donald Trump said that, what I am being told by a very senior source is that those comments from Donald Trump were not helpful, and the source said that is putting it politely. Chrystia Freeland is heading to Washington tomorrow, where she's going to be holding meetings with both Jim Mattis and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. In those meetings, she could have an opportunity to formally complain about what Donald Trump said. Canada has not formally complained, I'm told, about those comments. It's unclear if she's going to do that, but there will be an avenue open as to whether she's going to raise that concern about what Donald Trump had said and what it's done to Canada.
A lot to watch tomorrow. Thanks, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson. So what should the federal government's next move be, and how could it prevent relations from deteriorating any further? Matt DeCourcy is the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. Aaron O'Toole is the conservative critic for foreign affairs. And Nathan Cullen is the NDP's critic for democratic reform. They join me for the last time from the House foyer. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you there. Yeah, really appreciate you guys making time. Mr. DeCourcy, I'll start with you. Can you update us? We just heard Katie give what her understanding of the latest information is. Has any contact with either of these gentlemen been made by the government?
Well, Vashi, Global Affairs is certainly aware of where these two individuals are within China. Due to privacy considerations, I'm not at liberty to disclose where they are, but the minister has spoken with both the families. Our officials are providing consular services, as we always do. I mean, these are humans that we're talking about, and we always take the strongest considerations and give our best effort when we have Canadians who are detained abroad. And Canadians at home can rest assured that in this case, our officials are providing the best assistance that they possibly can, and that our minister is speaking with counterparts to ensure that they are treated well.
So just to be clear, and I take your point, the Foreign Affairs Minister has spoken with her counterpart in China?
We're speaking with officials around the world, and our officials are certainly working to get consular access to those individuals.
But they don't have it yet.
Country. Again, privacy considerations being what they are, I'm not really at liberty to disclose exactly what the interactions are, but Global Affairs and all our officials are working feverishly to ensure that these people are provided with the consular service that we owe them. And we've been in touch with the families as well to offer that consular service to them.
Mr. O'Toole, the Conservative Party's leader, Mr. Andrew Scheer, said today that the Prime Minister's, quote, naive approach to relations with China, he called it a policy of appeasement, has led in some part to Canada having no leverage in this situation. Can you expand on that? Does your party feel that the Prime Minister is really responsible for these men being detained?
Well, the Prime Minister has had a very strange approach with respect to China. It was his priority on a foreign policy basis to have a free trade agreement, and we remember the almost silly comments about his admiration for the basic dictatorship. But then his trip that was supposed to launch the free trade discussions didn't go well. They weren't even allowed to take photographs with Chinese leadership at the end. And now it's clear, Mr. DeCourcy, whenever they have privacy concerns, that means he didn't want to answer your question. They have not been in touch with the two Canadians on the ground. And it sounds like the minister has not spoken directly with her counterpart. Andrew Scheer has asked the Prime Minister to get in touch with Chinese leadership personally and intervene, because this is clearly a tit for tat in relation to the detention in Canada of a Huawei official. It went from one senior former diplomat for Canada now to two Canadians. So the Prime Minister needs to take charge on this directly and realize that this tit for tat cannot continue, or they should warn Canadians about travel to China.
And I'll ask Mr. DeCourcy about the Prime Minister's involvement, but I just want to be clear, because, I mean, this is retaliation from everything we've been led to believe from China for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. That arrest is something that happened outside of the political process. Are you trying to allege, is your party trying to allege that isn't the case?
This is clearly a retaliation. We haven't been able to hear from the government in terms of what the Canadians on the ground are saying the reasons they were detained were. There was one detention, then we learn of another one. We're not even sure where they are. So it's clearly...
So you think it's the Prime Minister's fault, though? That's what I just don't get. If it's in retaliation for those arrests, that was outside of the political process. That's something that happened in the legal system.
The extradition clearly had political ramifications, Vashi, because it took place on a weekend, and Canadians didn't learn until it was leaked to the Globe and Mail several days later, and the Prime Minister acknowledged he knew about the extradition before the arrest was made. So certainly there are political overtones to this.
Does that mean political interference or overtones?
Overtones for sure. Certainly in Washington, Canada is seen as very weak on Chinese relations. The Norsat sale of a Canadian company with Pentagon contracts still gets talked about in the U.S. That led to a U.S. thinking we were a weak entry point for Chinese technologies, these sorts of things. So I think the Prime Minister's playing catch up in terms of how the Five Eyes allies look at China. And now we're in a situation where I think he has to personally intervene to make sure that there's not more Canadians detained in this tit-for-tat war.
Mr. Cullen, do you think that there is a political aspect to all of this, I guess?
Well, I mean, we're stuck between these two trading global giants who are fighting with each other on a constant off and on basis, with Mr. Trump in the office, who really, I think the extradition treaty, let's start there, that there were concerns about Huawei and the CFO of Huawei, this woman in particular, having breached an embargo in deals with Iran. We were asked as a country to perform an extradition hearing to potentially bring her charges in the U.S. on those allegations, and Canada is a rule of law. I believe the country had to respect that. Now, Mr. Trump has made that incredibly difficult by suggesting this isn't just about the courts and the rule of law. He's inserted himself into say, well, if China gets better on trade, maybe we'll forgive the charges against this CFO of this Chinese company. That makes it incredibly difficult for Mr. Trudeau to be able to say this is entirely in the courts when Trump is alleging that there's politics involved. Now, the retaliation that China is now taking by arresting Canadians in China, and we see the op-eds and we see the attacks against us as a country, worry me greatly because it becomes some sort of, I want to use the term carefully, but prisoner exchange, where they say, well, if you let her go, this Chinese business official, then we'll let your Canadians go. And the fact that we haven't made contact through consular affairs worries me greatly and worries those families. And the privacy stuff, we've had Canadians taken before, and when we make contact, the Canadian government tells us that. Mm-hmm. And when we don't, the Canadian government tells us that too. I just, with all respect to Matt, I know he has a point of view to deliver, but that worries me that I don't think we've made contact with these Canadians who are now potentially, pawns in this very, very intense game of chess at the global level.
Mr. DeCourcy, does Mr. O'Toole have a point? Should the Prime Minister himself be intervening right now?
Like I said, our consular officials are dealing with the case of these two individuals who are detained in China. It's frivolous for the opposition to suggest that there has been political motivation to this. No one has made that link whatsoever.
But there are still two people being detained. Right, should the Prime Minister
and they are serious considerations, and there are mechanisms and steps through which our officials take careful consideration to make sure that consular services can be provided to the individuals as well as their families, and Canadians across the country can rest assured that our professional officials are doing everything that they can to provide the appropriate services to these individuals.
But look, Mr. DeCourcy, I remember a time when Mohamed Fahmy was detained, and your party was incredibly critical of the Conservatives at the time because Mr. Harper himself didn't make the call. Is there, at which point does the Prime Minister intervene then, if he hasn't already?
Well, again, I'm not going to speak about things that I'm not at liberty to speak about, other than to stress for Canadians that the consular services are our utmost priority, and are looking after these two individuals who are in China as well as their families is always the primary consideration for the Government of Canada in these delicate situations.
Mr. O'Toole, go ahead.
This is the concern we've had for some time, Vashi. Chinese state-owned enterprises are arms of the Chinese state. So you can see that China feels that a detention of an executive with Huawei is like a detention of one of their diplomatic officials. They almost want diplomatic immunity. At the same time, they try and suggest that they're a corporation just like any other corporation.
To be fair, Mr. O'Toole, when your party was in government, you let a state-owned corporation buy an oil company in Alberta, though.
Absolutely, because there were no direct security considerations at play. With the Norsat transaction, there were Pentagon contracts. The pressure we put on the Aecon deal because of strategic infrastructure in British Columbia, dams and nuclear refurbishments in my riding in Durham. This is the issue, is we need to engage in trade, but the state-owned enterprises themselves, we have to view as extensions of the Chinese state. And clearly the Chinese, the ambassador, I've said this to him personally, they are not crown corporations. Their senior executives have to be members of the Communist Party, and this is leading to this blurring of the lines between where does the Chinese state end and where do their corporations end. And I think now we're seeing Canadian civilians drawn into it. That's why we'd like to see the Prime Minister take charge.
Mr. Cullen, do you think the Prime Minister needs to intervene like the Conservatives do?
Well, one of the concerns is that this keeps accelerating and getting worse and worse. Like, I guess, can we imagine waking up tomorrow and hearing the news of another Canadian being detained by the Chinese without us having any access or knowledge of where they are? And Canada, I know the government is considering a travel advisory for the country of China. I guess there's some tragic irony in this, as China has pretended to be and portrayed itself on the world stage as a place where you can and must do business. But the way that they're demonstrating how politics and business in their mind mix with these very strong accusations against the Canadian government for performing an extradition treaty hearing and a charge that has been brought by one of our allies raises those concerns, because at the end of the day, Huawei is under great concern by the US, the UK, Australia, and others, saying if you're going to buy into this technology and embed it in your infrastructure, there are privacy and, in some cases, military concerns about this. And the Liberal government to this point has so desperately wanted to get into the trade talks with China. They've been much, much more reticent than many of our allies in the democratic world at
They've shown restraint, though. They've shown restraint too, though. They're not.
To
they're not to Huawei. They're reviewing it. They're reviewing it. There's the official line is there's a review underway. They haven't said yes for 100%.
Yeah, but given their track record in terms of the permissibility when dealing with China, one doesn't have a lot of hope. So that at the end of the day, we're dealing with a very large and ambitious power in China who does not, it appears, from this case at least, respect our rules and our rule of law when it comes to something like an extradition treaty. Yet on the other side of the coin, I have some sympathy for Mr. Trudeau because he's got Donald Trump, who's clearly politicizing in his comments, opposing the comments that the ambassador to Canada made just a few hours before, I think it was. Mr. Trump said it's political, his ambassador said it's not, and now Canada's stuck in the middle, and a lot of our businesses are quite concerned. I'm concerned for the long term, and I'm definitely concerned for these two people that have been taken who may be just collateral damage in this exchange between the U.S. and China.
But what I would
really
say,
quickly,
Patrick,
Mr. Tversky, because I'm out of time.
What I would say, if there is concern, genuine concern for these two individuals, I would ask the opposition parties to allow our consular officials to do the good work that they do and do the good work they do with their families to make sure that we can provide them with the services that they need and that we can resolve the situation.
You don't even know where these folks are.
We support that. We want to see it escalated to the PM.
All right, we're out of time, but thank you so much to all three of you for joining us. As I said, for the last time from the House foyer, thanks to Matt DeCourcy, Aaron O'Toole, and Nathan Cullen. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Patrick.
All the best.
A diplomatic spat between Canada and China is intensifying after Beijing officials confirmed they have a second Canadian detained in China. The first was former Canadian diplomat Michael Kovrig, who now works for the International Crisis Group. So what do we know about the second gentleman detained? His name is Michael Spavor. Spavor is a Canadian businessman. He's reportedly based out of the Chinese city of Dandong, which borders North Korea. From there, he runs an organization that promotes tourism and investment in the neighboring country. Spavor's Facebook page includes photos with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. One shows him with the dictator on his yacht sharing Long Island iced teas. Spavor and Michael Kovrig are being investigated on suspicion of harming China's national security. The federal government here says it has raised their cases directly with Chinese authorities. This all began to unfold earlier this month when Canada detained Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on a request from American authorities. She now faces extradition to the U.S. Why has China targeted these two men, and what will happen to them now? Charles Burton is a professor of political science at Brock University, and an expert in Canada-China relations. He joins me now via Skype from St. Catharines. Hi, Professor Burton. Nice to see you.
Hi, Vashi.
Is there any doubt in your mind, Professor, that the detainment of these two individuals, Canadian individuals, is linked to the arrest of Huawei's CFO?
No, there's no doubt in my mind because of the way the Chinese has been phrased. It's pretty clear that this is retaliation. So I think that, the Chinese are going to very extreme lengths to try and pressure the Canadian government to the extent they can, because they're very concerned that if Ms. Meng is sent to the United States, that she could be compelled to provide information about the relationship between her company, Huawei, and the U.S. security and intelligence and the Chinese security and intelligence apparatus, which would be damaging to China's overall geopolitical stance, I guess.
Are you surprised at the lengths that they're then going to? You said, extreme lengths. Are you surprised that it's so extreme?
I think so. And also their use of language has been beyond undiplomatic in terms of slamming our country in relatively official statements, menacing and really very inappropriate in terms of normal diplomatic protocol. I would think that probably the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Chinese diplomats in Canada are under a lot of pressure from the center of the Chinese Communist Party to get Ms. Meng back to Beijing as soon as possible and to do all that they can to avoid the eventuality of her having to face U.S. justice and be subject to interrogation that could reveal things that go against China's overall strategy for its rise to power in the future years.
Do you think that means that there could be an escalation? We know that state-associated media are threatening the idea of an escalation retaliation. Do you think that will happen?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think that while the diplomats here in Canada might be reporting back to Beijing that, we have an independent judiciary and there's really no possibility of getting Ms. Meng back before an extradition process is complete, they're under pressure to get her back. And therefore, I think that they'll be doing more and more in terms of these kinds of things, arbitrary arrest of Canadians and probably in the trade area as well. I mean, I would say that we know that when Canadians are taken in by the state security ministry, that means that they're being accused of espionage, which means that they will be subject to a 60-day period of very brutal interrogation, following methods that are probably not consistent with a Convention Against Torture of the UN, and they won't see any lawyer until that 60-day period is over. And whether we'll get access to them at all, we certainly won't get access to them where they are incarcerated, but whether our embassy will get to see them at all over that period is very much in doubt. So, it's the severity of it and the emotional blow to all of us who know these gentlemen who are in the China field, including our Canadian diplomats who, of course, worked with Mr. Kovrig and are very emotionally affected because they know how bad things are for him right now in Chinese incarceration.
And we know, and this, of course, could be an evolving situation, but from the government, for example, that they have yet to make contact. Does that surprise you at all? You mentioned that there's a long period there that they'd be incarcerated.
Well, in these security cases, they don't regard it as subject to the normal diplomatic convention because they don't regard it as a proper arrest because it's been done by the security ministry and not by the public security ministry, the police, and normal judicial bodies. So under these sorts of circumstances, typically they don't allow access. The family don't know where they are or what's happened to them. No charge is made. And as I said, they don't get any lawyer. And it's unlikely that they will get contact with the Canadian embassy unless we are given an exemption. And they will be subject to this interrogation based on past experience with other foreigners like Peter Humphreys of Britain or Peter Dallins of Sweden. They will be subject to this very brutal interrogation until they break and give a confession, which will likely be broadcast on the Chinese TV, a confession under duress that, based on the past cases, also, of course, including Kevin Garrett, will be repudiated by the foreign national once they get out of China. But that could be a very long time from now.
Do you think, A, there's anything the Canadian government or Canada can do to prevent what you just described from happening, or B, to prevent an escalation beyond just the detainment and whatever happens to these two individuals?
I don't see us having very much power in this asymmetrical relationship. After the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, we did withdraw our ambassador and bring down our diplomatic representation because we were very displeased with the response we were getting from the Chinese authority to our concerns over this event. Maybe withdrawing Mr. McCallum for a period would send a serious message to the Chinese government, but my feeling is that this matter is well above the normal purview of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is a relatively weak player in the Chinese system. The State Security Ministry is a much more significant player. And Huawei is clearly, well, I think pretty clearly to me anyway, connected to the state security and People's Liberation Army. And so I don't think that the Foreign Ministry really has much influence over what's going on. And those, unfortunately, are the only people that were able to engage in this regard. So I think there's a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding, and enormous desperation on the part of the Chinese regime to prevent Ms. Meng from being sent to the United States, where she could, in fact, start to provide information to the U.S. government that would be highly disadvantageous to the current policies of the government of China.
You touched on Mr. Kovrig, but based on what you know about these two individuals, what is it that you think drew the Chinese government to them, or the Chinese authorities, I'm sorry?
Well, they have been active in sensitive areas. In the case of Mr. Spaver, it's a bit puzzling as he's been engaged in tourist tours to North Korea. And from the Canadian point of view, I think a lot of his activities are probably of concern to us in terms of the sanctions against North Korea, and shouldn't have been as much of concern to the government of the People's Republic, who as we know, encourages more interaction with North Korea to support their failing economy. So why he's been taken in, I don't know. Apparently, Mr. Svever and Mr. Kovrig have been in touch with each other with regard to matters relating to peace and resolution of conflict in that region. So it may be that the two cases will be related, but the Chinese government so far has indicated that the two are completely separate and that they're being kept in separate facilities and are being separately interrogated. So eventually we'll get the official Chinese line on this, but I don't think it'll be before the 60 days are up.
And what's your advice? I mean, or what's from where you sit, how dangerous do you think it is at this point to be a Canadian doing business in China or some kind of foreign diplomat? There's a lot of speculation. Should you be traveling? Should we not? The government has said to be reviewing that. What's your take on it?
I think our diplomats are not in danger because they have the protection of a diplomatic passport. So the worst that could happen to them would be persona non grata expulsion from China, which may happen. You know, they might decide to expel some of our people. With regard to other people, I'd say anybody working in the high tech area in China or negotiating in that area would be under some degree of threat, and people working in NGOs trying to engage Chinese minority peoples like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, it also could be sent to the State Security Ministry on the same sorts of charges, false charges of espionage. So, and I imagine a lot of Canadian delegations will decide that this is not a good time to go to China. And I would also expect a lot of Chinese delegations will not be coming here, particularly people who have a similar sort of status to Ms. Meng, who might feel that they could, in fact, also be subject to some extradition process if they've been engaged in activities that violate U.S. law. So, the whole thing is leading us to a situation where the only issue dominating Canada-China relations seems to be the Meng extradition case, and everything else seems to be subsumed by it. And certainly we won't be doing anything with loosening up our trade relations with China anytime soon.
All right. Thank you, Professor Burton. Appreciate your insight.
Good to speak with you.